Power in England was never held by kings alone. For over a century, much of it belonged to the Beauforts. They were born in scandal, the children of a prince and his mistress, carried into the world without name, without title, and without any right to the wealth and power that ran in their blood. And yet, through a papal decree, a stroke of a king's pen, and their own fierce will, they rose. They became cardinals and chancellors, earls and dukes. They married into the greatest houses in the land. They placed a Beaufort daughter on the throne of Scotland. They stood at the right hand of 3 English kings. And when civil war tore England apart, they bled on every battlefield from St Albans to Tewkesbury, until the last Beaufort duke was dragged from sanctuary and put to death. It should have been the end, but one woman remained, Margaret Beaufort, and she carried the family's blood all the way to the throne. Tonight, we tell the whole story, slowly and softly, to ease you into sleep. Welcome, and rest easy. You've found sleepy nobles. If this is your first night with us, consider yourself one of the household now. And if you've sat with us before, it's good to have you back by the fire. So lower the lights, rest your head, and let the cares of the day fall away. Tonight, we quietly open the doors of the House of Beaufort and tell their whole story, their rise, their power, and their place in history, unhurried and gentle to carry you softly into sleep. And if you have a moment before you drift off, a quiet like and a gentle comment about which Beaufort you found most fascinating, help these stories find others who need them. To understand the Beauforts, you must first understand the man who made them and the woman who held his heart for nearly 30 years. John of Gaunt was born in the year 1340 in the Flemish city of Ghent, and he was a prince of England in every sense of the word. His father was King Edward III, one of the most powerful monarchs in English history, and his mother was Philippa of Hainaut, a queen beloved for her grace and her gentle influence on the king. John was the third of Edward's surviving sons behind the celebrated Edward, known to history as the Black Prince, and Lionel of Antwerp, Duke of Clarence. As a younger son, John was not expected to wear the crown himself, but in the intricate game of medieval power, younger sons could still become extraordinarily influential. And John of Gaunt would become perhaps the most powerful man in England who never sat upon the throne. His title, Duke of Lancaster, came to him through his first wife, Blanche of Lancaster, whom he married in 1359. Blanche was the daughter of Henry of Grosmont, the first Duke of Lancaster, and through her, John inherited vast estates stretching across the north and Midlands of England. The Lancastrian inheritance made him fabulously wealthy. He held more land than any other nobleman in the kingdom. His income rivaled that of the king himself. His household was magnificent, his retinue enormous, and his political influence touched every corner of England and beyond. John and Blanche were married for nearly a decade, and by all accounts their union was a happy one. Blanche bore him several children, including the boy who would one day seize the throne of England and reign as Henry IV. But in 1368, when Blanche was still only in her mid-20s, she was struck down by plague, the same terrible sickness that had swept through Europe a generation earlier and continued to claim lives in waves throughout the century. John was left a widower, wealthy beyond measure, but alone. He did not remain alone for long. In 1371, John married again, this time to Constance of Castile, a Spanish princess who brought with her a claim to the throne of Castile in Spain. It was a political match through and through, designed to extend John's influence and ambitions across the sea. He would style himself King of Castile for the rest of his life, though he never succeeded in making the title a reality. Constance bore him a daughter, Katherine, who would eventually marry the King of Castile and bring the English and Castilian lines together. But John's marriage to Constance, for all its political usefulness, was not a love match. And it was during this second marriage that the great romance of his life began. Her name was Katherine. Katherine de Roet was born around 1349 or 1350, most likely in the province of Hainaut, the same region from which John's own mother, Queen Philippa, had come. Katherine's father was a man named Paun de Roet, a herald in the service of the English crown who was later knighted. The de Roet family was respectable but modest. They were not great landowners, not barons or earls, not the sort of people whose names echoed in the corridors of Westminster. They were, in the language of the time, people of service, loyal, capable but unremarkable. Katherine had a sister named Philippa, and Philippa de Roet made a marriage that would one day give the family an unexpected kind of fame. She married a man named Geoffrey Chaucer, the same Geoffrey Chaucer who would become the father of English poetry, the author of the Canterbury Tales. Through Philippa, the de Roet family would be remembered in literary history. But it was Katherine whose life would reshape the destiny of England. Around 1366, Katherine married Sir Hugh Swynford, a knight in the service of John of Gaunt. Hugh held the manor of Kettlethorpe in Lincolnshire, a modest estate that placed Katherine in the lower reaches of the English gentry. They were married at St Clement Danes Church in Westminster, and for a few years they lived the quiet life of a country knight and his wife. Katherine bore Hugh at least 2 children, a daughter named Blanche and a son named Thomas. Then, in 1371, Hugh Swynford was recalled to France to fight in the ongoing wars. He died there, probably of dysentery, though there were whispers at the time that he had been poisoned by a servant of John of Gaunt, a man named Nirac de Bayonne. Whether there was any truth to that rumour, no one can say. What is certain is that Hugh's death left Katherine a widow, still young, still in the service of the Lancastrian household, and now without a husband's protection. And it was somewhere in this period, perhaps even before Hugh's death, perhaps shortly after, that Katherine and John of Gaunt fell in love. The precise beginning of their affair is lost to history. Medieval chroniclers did not typically record the private moments of princes and their mistresses with the kind of detail that later ages would demand. What we know is that by the early 1370s, Katherine had become John's mistress, and that their relationship would endure for more than 2 decades, through all the political storms, the scandals, and the whispered disapproval of the English court. It was not a casual liaison. John of Gaunt was a man of enormous pride and vast ambition. He could have taken any mistress he chose and discarded her when she became inconvenient. But Katherine Swynford was different. She was intelligent, capable, and by every indication she held John's heart in a way that neither Blanche nor Constance quite had. The depth of their bond would only become clear years later, when John made a decision that shocked the English nobility to its core. But that was still a long way off. The affair was conducted with as much discretion as was possible for a man of John of Gaunt's stature, which is to say, not much discretion at all. The English court was a small and intimate world, where secrets were the currency of influence and where the private lives of the powerful were observed, discussed, and exploited by everyone with an interest in political advantage. John's relationship with Katherine was an open secret, whispered about in the corridors of power, debated by the clergy, and used by his political enemies as evidence of his moral unfitness for the authority he wielded. And John of Gaunt had many enemies. During the 1370s and 1380s, he was the most powerful and most controversial figure in English politics. His father, Edward III, had descended into senility and poor health in his final years, and John had effectively governed the kingdom in the old king's name. When the young Richard II inherited the throne as a boy of 10 in 1377, John continued to exercise enormous influence, and he was hated for it. The common people suspected him of tyranny. The clergy denounced his protection of the religious reformer John Wycliffe. The London mob attacked his magnificent palace of the Savoy during the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, burning it to the ground. John of Gaunt was a man who inspired both loyalty and loathing in equal measure, and his affair with Katherine Swynford only added to the sense that he was a man who played by his own rules, indifferent to the judgment of lesser men. In the meantime, their love produced children. 4 of them born between approximately 1373 and 1379, while John was still married to Constance of Castile. These children were, by every law and custom of medieval England, illegitimate. They were bastards, born outside of marriage, with no legal right to their father's name, his titles, or his lands. In an age when bloodline meant everything, when the right to rule, to inherit, to hold power flowed through legitimate descent, these children occupied a strange and painful position. They were the sons and daughter of one of the most powerful men in England, and yet they were nobody. John gave them a surname to mark them as his own, but it was not the name Lancaster. It was not Plantagenet. Instead, he chose a name drawn from one of his French properties, a lordship in Champagne, known as Montmorency Beaufort. The children would be called Beaufort. The eldest was John, born around 1373. Then came Henry, born around 1375. Then Thomas, born around 1377. And finally, the only daughter Joan, born around 1379. These 4 children, John, Henry, Thomas, and Joan, were raised in the Lancastrian household, educated, provided for, and acknowledged by their father. But they carried the stain of illegitimacy like a shadow. In the eyes of the law, they could inherit nothing. In the eyes of the church, they were the fruit of sin. In the eyes of the court, they were an open secret that everyone knew about, and no one quite knew what to do with. Katherine, for her part, seems to have occupied a difficult position. She served as governess to John's legitimate daughters by Blanche of Lancaster, which placed her in the intimate heart of the household, even as she carried on her affair with the Duke. The arrangement was a common one in the medieval world. Mistresses were often given domestic roles that kept them close to their lovers. But it required a particular kind of strength to navigate the emotional complexities of the situation. Katherine was raising John's legitimate children by day and sharing his bed by night, all while bearing and raising children of her own who would never enjoy the same rights as the children she was paid to care for. It was a life of quiet contradictions, lived in the narrow space between privilege and shame. The arrangement was widely known and widely disapproved of. In the late 1380s, amid growing political pressure and perhaps a genuine crisis of conscience, John seems to have distanced himself from Katherine. The affair appeared to end. Katherine withdrew to her property at Kettlethorpe in Lincolnshire, and for a time the whispers quieted. But love, when it runs that deep, is not so easily set aside. In the early 1390s, John and Katherine found their way back to one another, and then in 1394, Constance of Castile died. John of Gaunt was a widower for the second time. He was now in his mid-50s, one of the richest and most powerful men in Europe. And he was free. What he did next astonished everyone. On the 13th of January 1396, in the great cathedral of Lincoln, John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, married Katherine Swynford. It was an act that sent shockwaves through the English court. John was a prince of the blood, the son of a king, the father of a future king, and one of the highest-ranking men in the realm. Katherine was the widow of a minor knight, a woman of modest birth and no great fortune. In the rigid hierarchy of medieval England, where marriages among the nobility were political instruments carefully calibrated to build alliances and consolidate power, this union made no political sense at all. It was, quite simply, a marriage of love. The English nobility were appalled. The chronicler Thomas Walsingham recorded the general disgust with barely concealed contempt, noting that the Duke had lowered himself by marrying his former mistress. Other lords grumbled that a man of Gaunt's stature had debased his blood. Even within the royal family there was unease. John's nephew, King Richard II, seems to have been more sympathetic, perhaps because he understood that his uncle's goodwill was too valuable to lose over a question of propriety. But the sense of scandal was real, and it hung over the marriage like a cloud. John, however, had not married Katherine merely for sentiment. He had a purpose, and that purpose concerned their 4 children. For more than 20 years, the Beaufort children had lived in a kind of aristocratic limbo. They were acknowledged by their father, raised in his household, given an education and a standard of living befitting a duke's children. But they remained, in the eyes of the law, illegitimate. They could not inherit. They could not hold titles of their own right. They could not pass their father's blood to the next generation with the full authority of the law behind them. John of Gaunt meant to change that, and marrying Katherine was the first step. Within months of the wedding, John petitioned Pope Boniface IX to issue a papal bull declaring the Beaufort children legitimate. The Pope obliged. The bull was issued in 1396, and it declared that John, Henry, Thomas and Joan Beaufort were to be regarded as legitimate children, fully capable of inheriting titles, lands and honours. But John did not stop there. He knew that a papal decree, while powerful, was not the same as the force of English law. And so he took the next step. He petitioned Parliament. On the 6th of February, 1397, an Act of Parliament was passed under King Richard II, formally legitimising the Beaufort children. The Act was sweeping in its language. It declared the 4 Beauforts to be the legitimate offspring of John of Gaunt and Katherine Swynford, entitled to all the rights and dignities that legitimate birth conferred. And here is the crucial detail. The 1397 Act did not contain any clause barring the Beauforts from the royal succession. It did not say they could not inherit the crown. It said nothing about it at all. Whether this was an oversight, a deliberate omission, or simply a reflection of the fact that no one imagined the Beauforts would ever be in a position to claim the throne, it is impossible to know. What matters is that the original act of legitimization left the door, however slightly, open. For a few years this was enough. The Beauforts were legitimate. They could hold titles. They could marry well. They could serve the crown in positions of honour and power. The transformation in their status was remarkable. In the space of a single year, the 4 children of John of Gaunt and Katherine Swynford had gone from being, in the eyes of the law, nobody, to being members of the extended royal family. They were cousins of the king, half-siblings of a man who was about to become king, and connected through their father to every crowned head in Europe. The legitimization changed more than their legal standing. It changed their sense of themselves. The Beaufort children, who had grown up carrying the quiet burden of illegitimacy, were now men and women of rank and dignity. They could look any earl in the eye. They could sit in Parliament. They could marry the daughters and sons of the greatest families in England. The stain that had marked them from birth had been officially washed away. But stains once made are never entirely invisible. The memory of their origins, the whispered word, bastard, the knowledge that their parents' love had been, for more than 20 years, a scandal in the eyes of the court and a sin in the eyes of the church, would follow the Beauforts throughout their history. Their enemies would use it against them whenever it was convenient. Their friends would overlook it when it suited their purposes. And the question of whether the legitimization was truly complete, whether the 3 Latin words added a decade later had closed the door to the throne or merely pushed it shut without locking it, would haunt the family for generations and eventually be answered not by lawyers, but by soldiers on a muddy field in Leicestershire. John Beaufort, the eldest, was created Earl of Somerset by Richard II, and then elevated further to Marquess of Somerset and Dorset in 1397, a reward for his service in helping the king deal with the troublesome Lord's appellant. He was also married to Margaret Holland, the daughter of Thomas Holland, the 2nd Earl of Kent, who was himself the son of Joan of Kent, the celebrated Fair Maid of Kent and widow of the Black Prince. It was a brilliant match, linking the Beauforts to the wider royal family in yet another way. John of Gaunt died on the 3rd of February, 1399. He was 58 years old, and he had spent the last years of his life securing the future of his Beaufort children with the same tenacity he had once devoted to pursuing the crown of Castile. He was buried at Old St Paul's Cathedral in London beside his first wife, Blanche of Lancaster, the woman who had given him the Lancastrian inheritance and, through it, the foundation of his power. Katherine Swynford survived him by 4 years. She died in 1403 and was buried at Lincoln Cathedral, where she and John had been married. Her tomb would later be joined by that of her daughter Joan, who chose to be buried beside her mother rather than beside her own husband. A final act of devotion that speaks to the bond between mother and daughter. With John of Gaunt gone, the political landscape shifted. His legitimate son by Blanche of Lancaster, Henry Bolingbroke, had been exiled by Richard II and stripped of his Lancastrian inheritance. In the summer of 1399, Bolingbroke returned to England with an army, deposed Richard, and claimed the throne as Henry IV. It was the beginning of the Lancastrian dynasty, and it placed the Beauforts in a strange new position. They were now the half-siblings of the King of England. Henry IV valued his Beaufort half-brothers. They were capable men, educated, politically astute, and loyal to the Lancastrian cause. But Henry also understood that the legitimization of the Beauforts had created a potential problem. If the Beauforts were fully legitimate, and if the 1397 Act placed no restriction on their right to the succession, then they were, at least in theory, potential claimants to the throne. And Henry IV had 4 healthy sons of his own, whose claims he intended to protect. In the year 1407, Henry took action. He issued a set of letters patent that reconfirmed the legitimization of his Beaufort half-siblings. But with a crucial addition. Somewhere in the text of the document, 3 Latin words were inserted. Accepta dignitate regali, accept the royal dignity. The Beauforts were legitimate, yes. They could hold titles, inherit lands, serve as earls and bishops and chancellors, but they could not inherit the throne. The insertion of those 3 words has been debated by historians for centuries. The 1397 Act of Parliament had contained no such restriction. The Papal Bull had contained no such restriction. The words appear to have been squeezed into the document in a hand that may not have been the same as the rest of the text, leading some scholars to wonder whether it was Henry himself who added them, or a clerk acting on orders that may or may not have carried the king's full authority. What is certain is that the words were never submitted to Parliament for approval. They were never ratified as a formal act. They existed in the letters patent alone. Was it legally binding? Could a king, acting on his own authority, override an Act of Parliament that had said nothing about barring the Beauforts from the succession? The question would haunt the family for generations. It would not be answered by lawyers or by scholars. In the end, it would be answered on a battlefield, with a crown lying in the mud and a Tudor prince standing over the body of a dead king. But that day was still 80 years away. For now, the Beauforts had what they needed: legitimacy, titles, and the favour of a king who was also their brother. The stain of bastardy had been wiped away, even if a faint shadow remained. And the 4 children of John of Gaunt and Katherine Swynford, John, Henry, Thomas, and Joan, set about building their fortunes in the new Lancastrian England. The family emblem they chose was the portcullis, the heavy iron gate that guarded the entrance to a castle. It was a symbol of strength, of defence, of an unyielding will. In time it would be adopted by their descendants, the Tudors, and in time it would find its way onto the gates of the Palace of Westminster itself, where it remains to this day. A quiet reminder that the bastard children of a forbidden love story left their mark on the face of England forever. The 4 children of John of Gaunt and Katherine Swynford had been raised together, educated together, and legitimised together. But their paths through life would be remarkably different. One would become a crusader and a politician. One would become the richest churchman in England. One would become a soldier and die without an heir. And one, the only daughter, would produce a family so vast and so powerful that her blood would run through both sides of the greatest civil war England had ever known. Let us take them in turn. John Beaufort, the eldest, was born around 1373, and he was, from the beginning, a man of action. Before his legitimisation, while he was still technically a bastard with no legal standing, he had already sought out adventure in the way that restless young noblemen of the age often did, through crusade. He joined the expedition of Louis II, Duke of Bourbon, to North Africa, fighting against the Moors in a campaign that was more about glory than strategy. He also travelled to Lithuania, where he served alongside the Teutonic Knights in their brutal campaigns against the pagan peoples of the Baltic. These were not wars of national importance. They were wars of reputation, the kind of military pilgrimages that young men of noble blood undertook to prove their worth, to earn honour, and to make connections that would serve them when they returned home. When John of Gaunt secured the legitimisation of his children, the eldest John's fortunes changed dramatically. King Richard II created him Earl of Somerset, and in 1397 elevated him further to Marquess of Somerset and Dorset, a recognition of his service in helping Richard break the power of the Lords Appellant, the group of noblemen who had challenged the king's authority. 2 days before his elevation to Marquess, John was married to Margaret Holland, the daughter of Thomas Holland, the 2nd Earl of Kent. Margaret was the king's niece, which meant that the eldest Beaufort son had married directly into the royal family. But Richard II's reign did not last. When Henry Bolingbroke deposed Richard in 1399, the political ground shifted beneath the Beauforts' feet. The new king, Henry IV, was their half-brother, and he was not without affection for them. But he was also mindful of the dangers of appearing too generous to potential rivals. John Beaufort lost his marquessate. He was reduced back to the rank of Earl of Somerset, a demotion that stung even though the earldom itself was a considerable dignity. In 1401, however, he was formally declared loyal to the new regime, and he appeared in command of the English fleet in the years that followed, a sign that he remained trusted despite the political upheaval. John Beaufort, 1st Earl of Somerset, died on the 16th of March, 1410, at the Hospital of St Katharine's by the Tower of London. He was only about 37 years old. He was buried in St Michael's Chapel in Canterbury Cathedral. He left behind 6 children by Margaret Holland: Henry, Joan, John, Thomas, Edmund, and Margaret. These children would carry the Beaufort name into the next generation, and their stories would be woven into some of the most dramatic episodes in English history. The second Beaufort child was Henry, born around 1375, and from a young age it was clear that his path would be the church. In medieval England, younger sons of great families often entered the clergy, not necessarily out of piety, though some were devout, but because the church offered a parallel structure of wealth, power, and influence that mirrored the secular world. A bishop controlled vast estates, collected enormous revenues, and wielded political authority that rivaled that of any earl or duke. For a man of Henry Beaufort's intelligence and ambition, the church was not a retreat from power. It was a highway to it. Henry's rise was breathtakingly rapid. By 1397, while he was still in his early 20s, he was appointed Chancellor of the University of Oxford, a prestigious position that placed him at the heart of England's intellectual life. The following year, he was consecrated Bishop of Lincoln, one of the largest dioceses in the country. He was not yet 25. When his half-brother Henry IV came to the throne in 1399, Cardinal Beaufort, though he would not receive his cardinal's hat for many years yet, was guaranteed a place at the centre of English politics. In 1403, he became Lord Chancellor of England, the highest legal officer in the realm. The following year, he was appointed Bishop of Winchester, one of the richest sees in Christendom. The income from Winchester alone was staggering. It made Henry Beaufort one of the wealthiest men in England, and he would use that wealth to build a financial empire that propped up the English crown itself. We will return to Cardinal Henry Beaufort's later career in due course, for his story stretches across 4 decades of English history and touches the reigns of 3 kings. For now, let us simply note that by the first decade of the 15th century, the second Beaufort child had already positioned himself as one of the most powerful churchmen in Europe, a man whose influence would only grow as the years passed. The third Beaufort child was Thomas, born around 1377, most likely at the Château de Beaufort in Anjou, France, the property that had given the family its name. Thomas followed neither the political path of his eldest brother nor the ecclesiastical path of Henry. He was a soldier, plain and simple, a man of war in an age that demanded them. Thomas served with distinction during the 100 Years' War, the long and grinding conflict between England and France that had consumed English resources and English lives for generations. He held a succession of military and administrative posts. Admiral of the Fleet in 1403, Lord High Admiral, Captain of Calais. In 1410, his half-brother Henry IV appointed him Lord Chancellor, a role he held for 2 years before returning to active military service. When Henry V came to the throne in 1413 and renewed the war with France with devastating effectiveness, Thomas Beaufort was at his side. The young king was everything his father had not been: bold, decisive, and possessed of a military genius that would make him the most feared warrior in Europe. His victory at Agincourt in 1415 was one of the most remarkable triumphs in the history of medieval warfare, and it transformed England's position in France overnight. Thomas Beaufort, though he was not present at Agincourt itself, fought in the campaigns that followed. He served as a trusted military commander and administrator in the conquered territories, helping to maintain English control over the lands that Henry was steadily adding to his dominion. In recognition of his long and faithful service, he was created Duke of Exeter, one of the highest titles in the land, marking him as a member of the inner circle of Lancastrian power. When Henry V died suddenly in 1422, cut down by dysentery at the age of just 35, at the very height of his power, Thomas was named as one of the guardians of the infant king Henry VI. It was a position of enormous trust and responsibility, a recognition of the role that the Beaufort family had played in supporting the Lancastrian dynasty through 2 reigns. Thomas married Margaret Neville of Hornby, a match that connected the Beauforts to the great Neville family of the north. But the marriage produced only one child, a son named Henry, who died in infancy. Thomas Beaufort, Duke of Exeter, died on the 30th or 31st of December, 1426, at Greenwich. He was buried at the Abbey of Bury St Edmunds in Suffolk, where his remains were reportedly found in remarkably good condition some 350 years later. With his death, his line came to an end. Of the three Beaufort brothers, Thomas would leave the smallest mark on history. But he had served his family and his king with a soldier's loyalty that never wavered. The fourth and final child of John of Gaunt and Katherine Swynford was Joan, born around 1379. And Joan's story is, in many ways, the most quietly extraordinary of all. Joan Beaufort was married for the first time at the age of about 12 in 1391 to Robert Ferrers, the 5th Baron Boteler of Wem. The wedding took place at Beaufort-en-Valais in Anjou, France. It was a modest match by the standards of a Gaunt child, reflecting the fact that, at the time of the marriage, Joan was still illegitimate and her prospects were uncertain. She bore Robert 2 daughters before he died around 1395 or 1396, leaving Joan a widow at barely 16. Her second marriage, however, would change the map of English power. In November of 1396, the same year that her parents married and the papal bull of legitimization was issued, Joan married Ralph Neville, the first Earl of Westmoreland. Ralph was one of the most powerful magnates in the north of England, a man whose estates and influence stretched across Durham, Yorkshire and the northern borderlands. He had been married once before to Margaret Stafford, who had given him 12 children. Now, with Joan Beaufort as his second wife, he would father 14 more, 26 children from 2 marriages. It is a staggering number, even by medieval standards, and the politics of those 2 broods would shape the course of English history for generations to come. Ralph Neville's children by his first wife and his children by Joan Beaufort grew up in the same household, but they were not treated equally. Joan, with her royal blood and her fierce maternal ambition, ensured that her own children received the better marriages, the greater patronage, and, most importantly, the larger share of their father's vast estates. This favoritism created a bitter divide within the Neville family that would last for decades and would have consequences that Joan herself could never have foreseen. What made Joan's children truly remarkable was not their quantity. It was the strategic brilliance of their marriages. Joan Beaufort, with her royal blood and her fierce intelligence, ensured that her children were married into the most powerful families in England. Her daughter Katherine married the Duke of Norfolk. Her daughter Eleanor married the Earl of Northumberland. Her son Richard became the 5th Earl of Salisbury and married Alice Montague, the Salisbury heiress. And their son, Richard Neville, would become the man known to history as Warwick, the Kingmaker, the most powerful nobleman of his age. And then there was Cecily. Cecily Neville, Joan's youngest daughter, was born at Raby Castle in Durham on the 3rd of May, 1415. She was known as the Rose of Raby, and she would become one of the most important women in English history. At the age of 9, Cecily was betrothed to Richard Plantagenet, the Duke of York, a young man who possessed, through his descent from both the 2nd and 5th sons of Edward III, a claim to the English throne that was arguably stronger than that of the reigning king, Henry VI. They married in 1429, and their children included 2 future kings of England, Edward IV and Richard III. Think about what that means for a moment. Through Joan Beaufort's marriage to Ralph Neville, the blood of John of Gaunt and Katherine Swynford flowed into the House of York. The Yorkists, the great enemies of the Lancastrian dynasty that the Beauforts served so loyally, were themselves Beaufort descendants. When the Wars of the Roses tore England apart, with Lancaster on one side and York on the other, Beaufort blood ran on both sides of the divide. It was a family at war with itself, in the most literal and devastating sense. Joan herself did not live to see the worst of it. After Ralph Neville's death in 1425, Joan inherited the bulk of his vast estates, a decision that infuriated Ralph's children from his first marriage, who felt they had been cheated of their inheritance. Joan, with her royal connections and her formidable will, was too powerful to be challenged successfully. She held onto the lands until her death on the 13th of November, 1440, at Hewden in Yorkshire. She was about 61 years old. When she died, Joan made a choice that speaks volumes about where her heart truly lay. She chose to be buried not beside her husband, Ralph Neville, but beside her mother, Katherine Swynford, in the sanctuary of Lincoln Cathedral. It was as if, even in death, Joan wished to be known first and foremost as a Beaufort, as the daughter of the woman whose love had brought the family into being. Her tomb was damaged in 1644 during the English Civil War, when Cromwell's Roundhead soldiers desecrated the cathedral, but the memory endured. Joan Beaufort, the only daughter of John of Gaunt and Katherine Swynford, had planted the seeds of a dynasty that would outlast them all. The first Earl of Somerset's 6 children grew up in an England that was rapidly changing. Their father had died young at 37, but he had left them well positioned. They carried the Beaufort name, the blood of Edward III, and the protection of their powerful uncle, Cardinal Henry Beaufort. And among the eldest of these children, 2 would carry the family's influence far beyond the borders of England. The first was a daughter named Joan. Joan Beaufort was born around 1404, the daughter of John Beaufort, 1st Earl of Somerset, and Margaret Holland. She was named for her aunt, Joan Beaufort, the Countess of Westmoreland, and like her aunt, she would prove to be a woman of remarkable resilience. But while her aunt had married into the English nobility, this younger Joan's destiny lay to the north, in the cold and troubled kingdom of Scotland. Her story begins not with her own life, but with the captivity of a young Scottish king. James Stuart had become King of Scotland in 1406, when he was just 12 years old, but he had never set foot in Scotland as its ruler. His father, King Robert III, had tried to send the boy to France for safekeeping, away from the dangerous ambitions of his own uncle, Robert, Duke of Albany. But the ship carrying the young prince was intercepted by English vessels off Flamborough Head, and James was taken to England as a prisoner. His father, upon hearing the news, died of grief, or so the chroniclers claimed. James spent the next 18 years as a captive of the English crown. He was treated with the courtesy due to a king, housed in various royal residences, given an education, allowed to observe the workings of English government. But he was a prisoner nonetheless. His uncle, the Duke of Albany, served as regent in Scotland and showed no great eagerness to negotiate his nephew's release. The captivity dragged on through the reigns of Henry IV and Henry V, year after year, while Scotland was governed in James's name by men who had little interest in seeing him return. And then, somewhere in the quiet rooms of the English court, James fell in love with Joan Beaufort. The romance between James and Joan became one of the most celebrated love stories of the medieval age. James was a poet as well as a king, and he is said to have written one of the finest poems in the Scots language, a work known as The King is Quaere, or The King's Book, inspired by his love for Joan. In the poem, the narrator describes seeing a beautiful woman from his window as she walks in a garden below, and falling instantly and completely in love. Whether the poem describes the actual moment James first saw Joan, or whether it is a literary creation drawing on the conventions of courtly love, scholars have debated for centuries. What is beyond dispute is that the feeling was real. James and Joan's marriage would prove to be one of the most genuine partnerships in the history of the Scottish crown. The marriage was arranged as part of the negotiations for James's release from captivity. From the English perspective, a match between their royal prisoner and a Beaufort was a masterstroke of diplomacy. It would bind Scotland to England through family ties, and it would ensure that the Scottish king owed a personal debt to the Beaufort family and, through them, to the Lancastrian dynasty. Joan's dowry was substantial, and in a practical touch that suited the hard-headed politics of the age, it was subtracted from James's ransom, reducing the amount Scotland had to pay for its king's freedom. The wedding took place on the 12th of February, 1424, at the church of St Mary Overy in Southwark, the same church that stands today as Southwark Cathedral. The festivities were hosted by Joan's uncle, the formidable Cardinal Henry Beaufort, at nearby Winchester Palace. It was a grand occasion, a union of English and Scottish royalty blessed by one of the most powerful churchmen in Christendom. James was finally released from his captivity on the 28th of March, 1424, and the couple travelled north to Scotland together. On the 21st of May, they were crowned King and Queen of Scots at Scone Abbey, the ancient coronation site of the Scottish kings. Joan Beaufort, the granddaughter of a forbidden love affair, was now a queen. The years that followed were a period of vigorous reform in Scotland. James proved to be a strong and capable ruler, determined to impose order on a kingdom that had drifted into chaos during his long absence. He crushed the power of the Albany Stuarts, executing the Duke of Albany's son, Murdoch, and his grandsons at Stirling. He curbed the power of the Highland chiefs, bringing the Lord of the Isles to heel in a staged scene at Holyrood Abbey, where Joan herself played a role, publicly pleading with her husband for mercy, allowing James to appear both strong and compassionate at once. Together they had 8 children, including twin boys born around 1430, Alexander, who died in infancy, and James, who would survive to become James II of Scotland. Their daughters married into the royal houses of France, Austria, and Brittany, spreading Beaufort blood across the continent. But James's reforming zeal made him powerful enemies, and on the night of the 20th of February, 1437, those enemies struck. A group of conspirators led by supporters of Walter Stewart, the Earl of Athol, a man with his own claim to the Scottish throne, broke into the Blackfriars Monastery in Perth, where the king and queen were staying. James was cornered and murdered. Joan herself was wounded in the attack, struck by the assassins as she tried to protect her husband, but she survived. What happened next revealed the steel in Joan Beaufort's character. With her husband dead and her 6-year-old son now King James II, Joan seized control of the situation with a ferocity that startled even the hardened Scottish nobility. She gathered her husband's supporters, hunted down the assassins, and ensured that they were punished with a savagery that was exceptional even by the standards of the age. The Earl of Athol and his co-conspirators were subjected to prolonged and public executions. Joan's message was unmistakable. No one would threaten her son's throne and live. She served as regent of Scotland until 1439, when she married for a second time, to James Stewart, the Black Knight of Lorne, a loyal supporter of the crown. The marriage produced 3 more sons, but it also cost Joan her political influence. She was gradually sidelined from power, replaced by Scottish lords who had no wish to be governed by an English-born queen. Joan Beaufort, Queen of Scotland, died on the 15th of July, 1445, at Dunbar Castle. She was about 41 years old. She was buried in the church of the Carthusian Monastery in Perth, the same city where her husband had been murdered 8 years before. Through Joan, the blood of John of Gaunt and Katherine Swynford entered the royal line of Scotland. Her son, James II, continued the Stuart dynasty. Her daughter Margaret married Louis XI of France. The Beaufort line, born in scandal in the chambers of an English duke, now ran through the veins of Scottish kings and French princes. Meanwhile, back in England, another branch of the Beaufort tree was growing in a different direction, not through a single queen, but through a multitude of marriages. Joan Beaufort, Countess of Westmoreland, the original Joan, the only daughter of John of Gaunt and Katherine Swynford, had died in 1440, but the enormous family she had produced with Ralph Neville continued to shape English politics for decades. Her 14 children by Neville had married into the houses of Norfolk, Northumberland, Buckingham, Salisbury, and York. Through her daughter Anne, who married Humphrey Stafford, the first Duke of Buckingham, Beaufort blood entered the Stafford family. Through her son Richard, the 5th Earl of Salisbury, it entered the House of Neville Warwick. And through her daughter Cecily, it entered the House of York itself. Cecily Neville, the Rose of Raby, was perhaps the most consequential of all Joan's children. Her marriage to Richard, Duke of York, produced 13 children, including the future kings, Edward IV and Richard III. Cecily lived to the extraordinary age of 80, surviving the Wars of the Roses, the deaths of her husband and several of her children, and the final triumph of her grandson, by marriage, Henry VII, himself a Beaufort descendant through a different line. The irony was inescapable. The Beauforts had been barred from the throne by those 3 Latin words, Excepta dignitate regali. And yet, through Joan Beaufort's Neville descendants, the family's blood sat upon the throne regardless. When Edward IV was crowned in 1461, he was a Beaufort descendant through his mother, Cecily. When Richard III seized the crown in 1483, he too carried Beaufort blood. The family that had been told it could never rule had, through the patient work of marriage and motherhood, woven itself so thoroughly into the fabric of English royalty that it could never be removed. While Joan Beaufort was ruling Scotland, and Joan the Countess was building her Neville empire, the male line of the Beaufort family was following a path that would lead, step by step, toward catastrophe. The first Earl of Somerset's eldest son, Henry Beaufort, the second Earl, had died in 1418 at the age of just 17 during the siege of Rouen in France. He had gone to war as a boy and never returned. He was never married and left no children. His death meant that the earldom of Somerset passed to his younger brother, another John Beaufort, who would become the first Duke of Somerset, and whose life would be marked by captivity, disgrace, and a mysterious death that haunted the family for generations. John Beaufort was born on the 25th of March, 1404. He was baptized, he was raised in the Beaufort household, and at the age of 15, he went to war. In 1419, he joined his cousin Henry V's campaigns in France, part of the great English assault that followed the triumph at Agincourt. It was the kind of adventure that young nobles dreamed of, the chance to prove themselves in battle under the banner of the most celebrated warrior king of the age. But in 1421, adventure turned to disaster. John accompanied his stepfather, Thomas of Lancaster, Duke of Clarence, the king's younger brother, on a campaign in Anjou. At the Battle of Beaujeu, on the 22nd of March, the Duke of Clarence charged recklessly into the French lines and was killed. John Beaufort and his younger brother were captured by the French. What followed was 17 years of captivity. 17 years. The number is almost impossible to comprehend. John Beaufort was taken prisoner in 1421 when he was 17 years old. He was not released until 1438 when he was 34. The best years of his youth. The years when other men were building careers, winning battles, marrying and starting families, were spent in French captivity. He came of age in prison. He watched from behind walls as the war continued without him, as his family prospered and struggled without him, as England itself changed around him. Consider what he missed. While John languished in French hands, his uncle Cardinal Henry Beaufort rose to become one of the most powerful men in England and Europe. While John sat in a cell, his sister Joan married the King of Scotland and became a queen. While John waited for a ransom that never came, the English position in France, the very cause for which he had fought and been captured, began its long, slow collapse. The Treaty of Troyes in 1420 had promised that the English king would inherit the throne of France, but that promise was crumbling year by year as the French fought back, inspired by the extraordinary Joan of Arc. John Beaufort knew none of this firsthand. He learned of it through rumour, through letters that may or may not have reached him, through the fragmentary reports of guards and fellow prisoners. He came of age on the 25th of March, 1425, reaching his legal majority while still behind French walls. The earldom of Somerset was his by right, but it was an empty title for a man who could not exercise any of the powers that came with it. He could not sit in Parliament, could not manage his estates, could not serve the king. He was an earl in name and a prisoner in fact. When he was finally released and returned to England, probably in late 1438, John was a different man, older, harder, and carrying the weight of nearly 2 decades of lost time. The England he returned to was not the England he had left. Henry V was long dead. The infant Henry VI, now a grown man in his late teens, sat uneasily on a throne that his father had won with a warrior's strength and that the son seemed incapable of holding. The court was riven by factions. The French war was going badly, and the Beaufort family, though still powerful through the cardinal's influence, was no longer the unchallenged force it had once been. In 1439, John married Margaret Beauchamp, a wealthy heiress from Bedfordshire whose family held the manor of Bletsoe and other properties in the Midlands. The match was a good one financially. Margaret brought land and income that helped restore John's depleted resources. But it came late. John was 35, an old man by the standards of the age, and the great adventures of his youth had been stolen from him. The future he faced was uncertain. In 1443, King Henry VI, who was, by this time, a weak and easily manipulated monarch increasingly dominated by factions at court, created John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset. It was the highest title the family had yet achieved, and it came with a mission. John was to lead an army of 7,000 men to France, landing at Cherbourg and marching south to Gascony to shore up England's crumbling position in the war. The expedition was a catastrophe. John's army landed as planned, but from the start, things went wrong. He marched aimlessly through the French countryside, failing to achieve any significant military objective. At one point, he blundered into the town of La Guerche, which belonged to the Duke of Brittany, an ally of England. The incident was diplomatically embarrassing and militarily pointless. He set prisoners free in exchange for money from the Breton Duke, and then continued his purposeless march through Maine before finally retreating to England as winter closed in. The Duke of Somerset returned home in disgrace. He was banished from the royal court, stripped of his influence, and left to brood on the humiliation of his failure. And then, on the 27th of May, 1444, he died. The cause of his death has never been determined with certainty. Some chroniclers whispered that he had taken his own life, that the shame of his military failure, the disgrace of banishment, the crushing weight of a life that had begun in captivity and ended in dishonour, had been more than he could bear. Others believed he died of natural causes, perhaps of an illness contracted during the campaign. The truth, like so many truths in this story, has been lost to time. What we know for certain is that his death left behind one legitimate child, a daughter born on the 31st of May, 1443, at Bletsoe Castle in Bedfordshire. Her name was Margaret Beaufort. She was barely a year old when her father died, and she was an heiress. The sole legitimate child of a duke, with the blood of Edward III flowing in her veins. She was also, from the moment of her birth, a piece on the chessboard of English politics. A girl whose marriage would be arranged and rearranged by men who saw in her bloodline a tool of power. We will return to Margaret's story later, for it is the hinge on which the entire Beaufort narrative turns. But first, we must follow the last years of the man who had been the anchor of the Beaufort family for nearly half a century, Cardinal Henry Beaufort. By the time his nephew, the Duke of Somerset, died in disgrace in 1444, Cardinal Beaufort was nearly 70 years old. He had been at the centre of English politics for more than 4 decades. He had served as Lord Chancellor under 3 kings, Henry IV, Henry V, and Henry VI. He had lent enormous sums of money to the crown, financing wars, paying soldiers, and propping up a government that might otherwise have collapsed under the weight of its own debts. His personal fortune was immense. The revenues from the bishopric of Winchester, combined with his profits from lending and his accumulated wealth, made him one of the richest men in Europe. The cardinal's wealth was not merely a matter of personal luxury, though he certainly lived in considerable comfort, maintaining a household that was the envy of many secular lords. His real power lay in his ability to lend. Medieval kings were perpetually short of money. Wars were hideously expensive, and the ordinary revenues of the crown, taxes, customs duties, income from royal estates, were never enough to cover the costs of a major military campaign. Kings had to borrow, and Cardinal Beaufort was the man they borrowed from. The scale of his lending was extraordinary. From 1417 onward, the cardinal advanced vast sums to the crown, money that paid for soldiers, ships, weapons, and supplies during the crucial final phase of the 100 Years' War. His loans to Henry V helped finance the campaigns that followed Agincourt and led to the Treaty of Troyes. His loans to the government of the infant Henry VI kept the English position in France alive during the long and difficult years of the Regency. In return, the cardinal received interest, influence, and an indispensable position in government. There was little his enemies could do against the man on whom the solvency of the state depended. He was, in a very real sense, too rich to fail. But wealth alone did not define Cardinal Beaufort. He was also a man of fierce ambition and considerable political skill. His long career had been marked by a series of bitter rivalries, most notably with Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, the youngest brother of Henry V, who served as Lord Protector during the minority of Henry VI. Humphrey and the cardinal despised each other. Their feud was personal as well as political, rooted in competing visions for the governance of England and fueled by mutual contempt. Humphrey accused the cardinal of putting his own interests, and the interests of the papacy, ahead of the interests of England. The cardinal regarded Humphrey as a reckless, self-aggrandizing fool whose incompetence threatened the stability of the realm. Their quarrel played out across decades, erupting periodically in confrontations at court and in Parliament, each man seeking to undermine the other while maintaining a veneer of loyalty to the young king. At one point in 1425, the situation nearly escalated to armed violence. Both men gathered armed retainers in London, and only the intervention of cooler heads prevented bloodshed in the streets of the capital. The cardinal had also navigated the treacherous waters of papal politics with considerable skill. Pope Martin V had made him a cardinal in 1426 and appointed him papal legate, a position of enormous ecclesiastical authority that allowed him to act as the Pope's representative in England and across northern Europe. Henry V had previously forced Beaufort to resign a cardinal's hat offered in 1417, fearing that his uncle would become an instrument of papal policy in England. But after Henry's death, there was no one strong enough to prevent Beaufort from accepting the honour a second time. The cardinal was involved in the Hussite crusade in Bohemia, the Church's attempt to stamp out the religious reform movement inspired by the teachings of Jan Hus. He served as papal legate in Germany, Hungary and Bohemia, lending his diplomatic skills and his considerable financial resources to the cause. In 1431, he achieved perhaps his most dramatic ceremonial role when he crowned the young Henry VI as King of France in Paris. A magnificent ceremony that was meant to legitimize England's claim to the French throne, but which, in the end, proved to be one of the last great gestures of a war that England was slowly and irreversibly losing. By the mid-1440s, the Cardinal's power was fading. He was old and the political landscape was shifting. New factions were emerging at court, and the Duke of Suffolk, William de la Pole, was rising to fill the void left by the decline of the Beauforts and their allies. Humphrey of Gloucester, the Cardinal's old enemy, was arrested on charges of treason in February of 1447 and died just 3 days later, possibly of a stroke, though there were dark whispers of poison. Cardinal Henry Beaufort followed his old rival into death less than 2 months later. He died on the 11th of April, 1447, at Wolvesey Palace in Winchester, the great bishop's palace that had been his seat of power for more than 4 decades. He was about 72 years old. Legend has a famous scene associated with his death. It was said that on his deathbed, as his mind wandered in delirium, the cardinal cried out in anguish, offering the whole treasury of England to death itself, if only he could be allowed to live a little longer. Shakespeare would later dramatize this scene in his play Henry VI, Part 1, painting the cardinal as a man whose vast wealth could not save him from the grave. A fitting image for a man who had spent his life accumulating power and gold only to leave it all behind. Whether the deathbed scene happened as described, or whether it is a later embellishment, we cannot say. What is certain is that when Cardinal Henry Beaufort died, the last of the 4 original Beaufort children was gone. John of Gaunt and Katherine Swynford's children, John the Earl, Henry the Cardinal, Thomas the Duke and Joan the Countess, had all passed from the stage. The family's story was now in the hands of the next generation, and the next generation would tear England apart. The death of Cardinal Henry Beaufort in 1447 and the death of John Beaufort, 1st Duke of Somerset, in 1444, left the family's political fortunes in the hands of one man, Edmund Beaufort, the youngest son of John Beaufort, 1st Earl of Somerset. Edmund was born around 1406, the 4th and last surviving son of the Earl. He was the youngest of the brothers, and for much of his early life, he had lived in the shadow of his older siblings. His brother Henry had died at 17. His brother John had spent 17 years in a French prison. His brother Thomas had been killed fighting in France. Edmund had survived them all, and now, with the Cardinal dead and the Duke of Somerset's line reduced to a baby girl, he was the most senior male Beaufort in England. Edmund Beaufort was a man of considerable charm, undeniable courage, and deeply questionable judgment. He had served in the French wars with distinction, earning a reputation as a brave soldier and a capable commander. He was created Earl of Dorset in 1441 and inherited the earldom of Somerset from his brother in 1444, after the Duke's death. In 1448, King Henry VI created him Duke of Somerset, giving him the highest title in the family and signalling his position as the king's most trusted advisor. And that was the problem. Henry VI was not a strong king. He was gentle, pious, prone to bouts of mental illness that left him unable to govern and easily manipulated by the men around him. He had come to the throne as a 9-month-old infant in 1422, and his entire life had been spent in the shadow of men who were stronger, more decisive, and more ruthless than he would ever be. His father, Henry V, had been one of the greatest warrior kings in English history, a man who had conquered France and united Europe in awe. His son was the precise opposite, a man of prayer and contemplation who shrank from conflict, who preferred the company of scholars and clerics to that of soldiers and politicians, and who seemed genuinely bewildered by the violent world he had been born to rule. Henry relied on favourites, and Edmund Beaufort became the greatest favourite of all. The king showered Somerset with offices, titles, and responsibilities, drawing him ever closer to the centre of power. And in doing so, he created a target for every nobleman in England who felt excluded from the royal circle. The king's generosity to Somerset was not merely lavish, it was provocative. He compensated Somerset with offices and grants worth thousands of pounds, while other magnates who had served the crown faithfully were passed over and ignored. Chief among those excluded was Richard Plantagenet, Duke of York. Richard of York was, by most measures, the most powerful nobleman in England. He was descended from Edward III through two lines, from Lionel of Antwerp, Duke of Clarence, Edward's second surviving son, through his mother, and from Edmund of Langley, Duke of York, Edward's fifth son, through his father. This gave him a claim to the throne that was, in the eyes of many, stronger than that of Henry VI himself, who descended from John of Gaunt, Edward's third surviving son. York was also, through his mother Cecily Neville, a Beaufort descendant, a grandson of Joan Beaufort, the Countess of Westmoreland. The family that had been barred from the throne was now, through the tangled web of medieval marriage, connected to the very man who would challenge the king for it. The rivalry between Edmund Beaufort and Richard of York was not merely personal, though it was certainly that. It was a struggle over the direction of the kingdom. York had served as lieutenant general in France from 1436 to 1437, and again from 1440 to 1445. And during his time there he had been forced to fund much of the war effort from his own pocket. He had been promised support that never came, reinforcements that were diverted, and payments that were delayed. He watched with growing fury as Edmund Beaufort and his allies at court were given the resources and the glory that York believed should have been his. The resentment ran deep. York had served the crown loyally and at enormous personal expense, only to be recalled and replaced by men he considered his inferiors. When York returned to England, he found that Beaufort had taken his place, not only in France, where Edmund was appointed Captain General in 1447, but at court, where Edmund stood at the king's right hand and wielded influence that York could only dream of. The king compensated Somerset with offices worth thousands of pounds, further inflaming the resentment of York and his supporters. York was not a man who suffered slights quietly. He was proud, powerful, and increasingly convinced that the kingdom was being mismanaged by a clique of self-serving courtiers led by Somerset. He was also acutely aware of his own royal blood. Through his mother Anne Mortimer, he was descended from Lionel of Antwerp, the second surviving son of Edward III, giving him a claim to the throne that was, by the rules of primogeniture, senior to that of the Lancastrian kings. Whether York actively sought the crown at this stage, or whether he merely wanted to be recognised as the heir presumptive and given a voice in government, is a question that historians continue to debate. What is clear is that he would not tolerate being pushed aside by a Beaufort. And then France collapsed. In 1449, the French launched a devastating counterattack that swept the English from Normandy in a matter of months. City after city fell: Rouen, Caen, Falaise, Cherbourg. Names that had been synonymous with English power in France for a generation. The military catastrophe was staggering. Territory that Henry V had conquered at enormous cost. Territory that English soldiers had fought and died for over decades was lost in a single campaign. By 1450, the English position in Normandy was finished. Within a few more years, Gascony would follow, and the 100 Years' War would end in total French victory. And the man who bore the greatest responsibility for the disaster was Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, who had been in command of the English forces in France. Beaufort's poor leadership, his failure to prepare adequate defences, his inability to coordinate his forces, his tactical blunders, was widely blamed for the loss of Normandy. When he returned to England in 1450, he was a marked man. York and his allies demanded that Somerset be called to account for the French debacle. The Commons in Parliament clamoured for his arrest. Popular uprisings, including the dangerous rebellion led by Jack Cade in 1450, explicitly named Somerset as one of the traitors who had ruined the kingdom. But Henry VI stood by his favourite. The king protected Somerset, shielded him from prosecution, and continued to heap honours upon him. In the eyes of York and his supporters, it was proof that the government was rotten, that a weak king controlled by an incompetent and self-serving favourite was leading England to ruin. In 1453, the situation reached a crisis. The loss of Gascony, the last English territory in France which had been in English hands for 300 years, dealt the final blow to English prestige and shattered whatever remained of the government's credibility. And then, in August of 1453, Henry VI suffered a complete mental collapse. The king's illness, which modern historians have variously attributed to a form of catatonic schizophrenia, a depressive episode, or a condition inherited from his maternal grandfather, the famously mad Charles VI of France, was sudden and devastating. Henry fell into a state of complete unresponsiveness. He could not speak, could not move, could not recognize the people around him. He sat or lay in a stupor, unaware of the world, while his kingdom spun into chaos around him. He remained in this condition for over a year, through the birth of his own son, Prince Edward of Lancaster, in October of 1453, an event of which the king was entirely unaware. When the infant prince was presented to him, Henry gave no sign of recognition or understanding. The king's madness left a power vacuum at the heart of the government. Queen Margaret of Anjou, who had previously played a relatively modest political role, stepped forward to fill it, arguing that she should be appointed regent. But Parliament, unwilling to place the government in the hands of a woman, and a Frenchwoman at that, instead appointed Richard of York as Lord Protector to govern in the king's absence. York promptly had Somerset arrested and thrown into the Tower of London. The Duke was charged with responsibility for the loss of France, and with corruption in the management of the kingdom's affairs. For a few months it seemed as though York had won. Somerset was imprisoned, the government was in Yorkist hands, and the king was incapable of intervening. But then, at Christmas of 1454, Henry VI recovered. As suddenly and mysteriously as the illness had struck, it lifted. Henry resumed his kingship, immediately released Somerset from prison, and restored him to his former position of influence. York was stripped of the protectorship and pushed back to the margins. It was as if the past year had never happened, except that the hatreds it had generated were now deeper and more dangerous than ever. It was the breaking point. York would not accept being sidelined again. He gathered his forces, chief among them his allies the Neville Earls, Richard of Salisbury and his son, Richard of Warwick, both of them descendants of Joan Beaufort through the Neville line. Together they marched south toward London. On the 22nd of May, 1455, the two sides met at the market town of St Albans, just north of the capital. It was not a great battle by the standards of the age. The fighting lasted barely an hour, and the casualties were relatively light, but the men who died made it momentous. Edmund Beaufort, 2nd Duke of Somerset, was killed in the fighting at St Albans. According to tradition, he was cut down in the street outside the Castle Inn, fighting to the last. His death was a personal triumph for Richard of York, who had finally destroyed the rival who had stood between him and the king for years. Henry VI himself was wounded, struck in the neck by an arrow, and was captured by the Yorkists. The Battle of St Albans was the first battle of the Wars of the Roses. It was the moment when the political rivalry between Somerset and York, which had festered for years in council chambers and parliamentary debates, finally exploded into open violence. And at the heart of the explosion was a Beaufort, a grandson of John of Gaunt and Katherine Swynford, a man whose family had been born in scandal and raised to power only to become the spark that set England ablaze. Edmund Beaufort left behind 10 children. His eldest son, Henry, had been wounded at St Albans, an arrow wound that he survived, but that left him with a burning desire for revenge. Henry Beaufort, the 3rd Duke of Somerset, was 19 years old, and the war that had killed his father was only beginning. Henry Beaufort, 3rd Duke of Somerset, inherited his title at 19 years old, on a day when his father's blood was still wet in the streets of St Albans. He also inherited a war. From the moment of his father's death, the young Duke was consumed by a single purpose: the destruction of the House of York and the restoration of the Beaufort family to its former position at the right hand of the king. He was a Lancastrian to his core, fierce, proud, and driven by a hatred of the Yorkists that would carry him across a decade of battles, betrayals, and bloodshed. The years between 1455 and 1460 were a period of uneasy truce, punctuated by sporadic violence and relentless political manoeuvring. Henry VI recovered from his mental illness, at least temporarily, and the Queen, Margaret of Anjou, emerged as the true leader of the Lancastrian cause. Margaret was a formidable woman, intelligent, ruthless, and utterly devoted to preserving the throne for her husband and, more importantly, for her son Edward of Lancaster, born in 1453. Somerset became one of Margaret's closest allies. Together they worked to rebuild the Lancastrian position and to counter the growing power of York. The young Duke proved himself a capable military commander, and when open war erupted again in 1459, he was ready. The decisive year was 1460. At the Battle of Wakefield on the 30th of December, Somerset led the Lancastrian forces to a crushing victory over the Yorkists. Richard, Duke of York, the man who had killed Somerset's father at St Albans, was himself killed in the fighting, along with his son Edmund, the Earl of Rutland. It was a moment of savage poetic justice for the Beaufort family. The man who had destroyed their patriarch had himself been destroyed, and the head of Richard of York was placed on the gates of the city of York, reportedly wearing a paper crown in mockery of his royal pretensions. The victory at Wakefield was sweet, but it did not end the war. Richard of York's eldest son, Edward, was still alive, and the Yorkist cause, far from being crushed, was about to find its greatest champion. Less than 2 months later, on the 17th of February, 1461, Somerset won again at the Second Battle of St Albans, defeating the Yorkist forces and rescuing King Henry VI, who had been held as a prisoner by the Yorkists since the Battle of Northampton the previous year. The battle was a tactical masterpiece on Somerset's part. He outmaneuvered the Yorkist commander, the Earl of Warwick, and broke through his defensive positions in a series of flanking attacks that left Warwick's army shattered. The king was recovered, and for a brief, shining moment, it seemed as though the Lancastrian cause had triumphed, that the wars were over, and that the Beauforts had emerged victorious. But the moment did not last, and the reason it did not last reveals one of the most consequential mistakes of the entire war. After the victory at St Albans, Queen Margaret of Anjou hesitated. Instead of marching immediately on London, which was poorly defended and could have been taken with relative ease, she lingered in the north, consolidating her forces and waiting. It was a fatal delay. The citizens of London, already fearful of the Northern Army's reputation for plunder and violence, closed the gates of the capital. And while Margaret waited, The young Edward of York was winning a decisive victory of his own at the Battle of Mortimer's Cross in Wales, shattering a Lancastrian force and establishing his reputation as a formidable commander. Edward marched on London. The citizens who had grown weary of the Lancastrian queen's harsh demands and mistrustful of her northern soldiers opened the gates to the young Yorkist prince. On the 4th of March, 1461, Edward was proclaimed King Edward IV. He was 18 years old, over 6 feet tall, handsome, and possessed of a natural charisma that Henry VI had never displayed. The contrast between the two kings could not have been more stark. And then came Towton. The Battle of Towton, fought on the 29th of March, 1461, in a blinding snowstorm on the fields of Yorkshire, was the largest and bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. The armies that clashed that day were enormous by medieval standards, perhaps 50,000 men between them, though exact numbers are impossible to determine. Estimates of the casualties vary, but most historians agree that tens of thousands of men fell that day. Some cut down in the fighting, others drowned in the swollen River Cock as they fled. Still others hunted down and killed in the bloody pursuit that followed. It was a slaughter that dwarfed anything the Wars of the Roses had produced before or would produce again. The battlefield was a gently sloping field between the villages of Towton and Saxton, and the conditions were terrible. A fierce snowstorm blew into the faces of the Lancastrian army, blinding them and driving their arrows short of the Yorkist lines, while Edward's archers, with the wind at their backs, could fire deeper and more accurately. The fighting was savage and prolonged, lasting for hours without a decisive advantage on either side. It was only when the Duke of Norfolk's reinforcements arrived on the Yorkist flank that the balance finally tipped. The Lancastrian line broke, and the retreat became a rout. The Lancastrians were annihilated. Somerset fought in the battle, but when the Yorkist line held and the Lancastrian flank collapsed, the day was lost. Somerset fled the field and made his way north to Scotland, where he joined the remnants of the Lancastrian court in exile. King Henry VI and Queen Margaret of Anjou had also escaped, and for the next few years they maintained a shadow court in Scotland, hoping for foreign aid that would allow them to reclaim the throne. Somerset was attainted by the Yorkist Parliament. His titles were formally stripped, his estates confiscated, his very name declared traitor. He was a duke without a duchy, a commander without an army, a Beaufort without a home. In desperation, Somerset travelled to France to seek help, but he was imprisoned for a time and found little support. He moved through Flanders and back to Scotland, a man adrift in a hostile world. And then, in 1463, he did something that shocked everyone. He defected to Edward IV. The details of Somerset's defection are murky, but the broad outline is clear. Edward IV, a shrewd politician as well as a brilliant soldier, offered Somerset a pardon and the restoration of his titles. Somerset accepted. For the next year or so, the Duke was a fixture at the Yorkist court, attending Edward, offering military advice and apparently living in genuine comfort and favour. It was an extraordinary turnaround, the most prominent Lancastrian commander in England, welcomed into the inner circle of the Yorkist king. But it could not last. Whether Somerset had always intended to betray Edward, or whether the pull of his Lancastrian loyalties proved too strong to resist, the result was the same. At the end of 1463, Somerset slipped away from the Yorkist court, hurried north, and began raising troops for one final Lancastrian effort. The rebellion was doomed from the start. Somerset's forces were small, poorly supplied, and operating in territory that was increasingly under Yorkist control. In April of 1464, the Lancastrians attempted to ambush a Yorkist force under John Neville, Lord Montague, at Hedgeley Moor, but the attack failed and the Lancastrians were scattered. Then came the end. On the 15th of May, 1464, the Lancastrian remnant faced Montague's army at the Battle of Hexham in Northumberland. It was not much of a battle. The Lancastrian force was small and quickly overwhelmed. Somerset was captured in the aftermath, found hiding in a barn at a place that would later be known as Duke's House. There was no trial, no hearing, no mercy. Henry Beaufort, 3rd Duke of Somerset, was taken to the marketplace in Hexham and beheaded on the same day. He was 28 years old. His body was buried at Hexham Abbey. Montague showed no mercy to the other Lancastrian leaders either. Over the next few days, some 30 prominent Lancastrians were rounded up and executed. The Lancastrian resistance in the north of England collapsed entirely. King Henry VI fled into hiding, sheltered by sympathetic households across the north, a fugitive king in his own kingdom. Somerset left behind no legitimate children, but he did leave one son, an illegitimate boy named Charles, born around 1460 to his mistress Joan Hill. This child, raised in exile in Flanders, would later return to England under the Tudors and thrive. He would be given the surname Somerset and created Earl of Worcester. From him would descend the Earls and Marquesses of Worcester and, eventually, the Dukes of Beaufort, the family that bears the Beaufort name to this very day. But that was far in the future. In the spring of 1464, the Beaufort cause seemed finished. Henry VI was a fugitive, wandering the moors and forests of the north, sheltered by loyal households and hunted by Yorkist agents. He would eventually be captured in 1465, found hiding in a Lancashire farmhouse, and taken to the Tower of London, where he would spend the next 5 years as a prisoner. The years between 1464 and 1470 were a period of apparent Yorkist triumph. Edward IV consolidated his grip on the throne, married the beautiful Elizabeth Woodville, a controversial choice that would cause its own share of trouble, and governed with a mixture of charm, shrewdness, and occasional ruthlessness that made him popular with the commons, if not always with his nobles. The Lancastrian cause seemed dead, and the Beaufort name seemed destined to fade into the dusty pages of history. And yet, the family's suffering was not over. Somerset's younger brother, Edmund Beaufort, sometimes called the 4th Duke of Somerset, though his claim to the title was disputed, remained a committed Lancastrian. Born around 1438, Edmund had been in exile since the disaster at Towton, living in France and Burgundy with the scattered remnants of the Lancastrian court. He had been imprisoned in the Tower of London for a time after being captured on the Isle of Wight in 1460, but had eventually made his way back to the continent. He was a man without a home, without wealth, without any realistic prospect of regaining what his family had lost. But he was still a Beaufort, and the Beauforts did not give up. In 1470, an astonishing reversal of fortune brought the Lancastrians briefly back to power. The Earl of Warwick, the great kingmaker, himself a descendant of Joan Beaufort through the Neville line, had quarrelled with Edward IV and switched sides, allying himself with Queen Margaret of Anjou. It was one of the most dramatic reversals in the entire saga of the Wars of the Roses. Warwick, the man who had done more than anyone to put Edward on the throne, the man whose military genius had won the battles that destroyed the Lancastrian cause, had fallen out with the king over questions of foreign policy and royal patronage, and had decided that if Edward would not listen to him, then Edward would have to go. The alliance between Warwick and Margaret of Anjou was sealed by the marriage of Warwick's daughter, Anne Neville, to Margaret's son, Prince Edward of Lancaster. It was an extraordinary pairing. The daughter of the man who had fought the Lancastrians for years, married to the Lancastrian heir. But in the merciless logic of 15th century politics, yesterday's mortal enemy could become tomorrow's essential ally, and both Warwick and Margaret were willing to swallow their hatred if it meant reclaiming power. Together, they drove Edward into exile and restored Henry VI to the throne in what became known as the Readeption. Henry, broken by years of captivity and mental illness, was paraded through the streets of London as a symbol of the restored Lancastrian order. He was, by all accounts, a pitiful figure, confused, passive, and unable to comprehend the political forces swirling around him. The real power lay with Warwick, and with the Lancastrian lords who had returned from exile to reclaim their places. Edmund Beaufort returned to England with the Readeption, but he was unenthusiastic about the alliance with Warwick, the man whose family had been instrumental in the deaths of so many Lancastrians. He made little effort to cooperate with the Kingmaker, and his failure to hold London against the returning Edward IV was a critical blunder. Edward entered the capital unopposed, recaptured the hapless Henry VI, and prepared for the final reckoning. The Battle of Barnet on the 14th of April, 1471, destroyed the Kingmaker. Warwick was killed in the fighting, and with him died the last best hope of a Lancastrian-Yorkist reconciliation. But for Edmund Beaufort, the true end came 2 weeks later, in the west of England. On the 4th of May, 1471, the Lancastrian army met Edward IV's forces at Tewkesbury in Gloucestershire. It was a beautiful spring day. The meadows were green, the River Severn glinted in the sunlight, and the ancient abbey rose above the town like a stone prayer. Queen Margaret of Anjou and her son, Prince Edward of Lancaster, were present. The future of the Lancastrian dynasty rode on the outcome of this single battle. If the Lancastrians won, Henry VI would be restored to the throne and the House of Lancaster would survive. If they lost, the cause was finished. Edmund Beaufort commanded the right wing of the Lancastrian army. He had positioned his forces in a strong defensive position, using the natural cover of hedgerows and rough ground to protect his flanks. When the fighting began, he led a fierce charge against the Yorkist forces under Lord Hastings, surging forward from his defensive position in a bold attempt to break the enemy line. For a time, the charge seemed to succeed. The Yorkists were pushed back across the meadow that would later be known as Bloody Meadow, and the Lancastrian right advanced with momentum and fury. But the rest of the Lancastrian line did not follow. The centre, commanded by Prince Edward of Lancaster, and the left, commanded by the Earl of Devon, either failed to coordinate their advance or were themselves engaged and unable to support Somerset's attack. Whether through confusion, cowardice, or simple bad luck, the centre and left of the army failed to match Somerset's assault. The charge stalled. Edmund Beaufort found himself isolated, his men exposed on open ground with no support. The Yorkists regrouped, and Edward IV, commanding from the centre, sent a reserve force, possibly hidden in a nearby wood, crashing into Somerset's flank. The Lancastrian right collapsed, and the rout spread across the entire army. Prince Edward of Lancaster, the teenage son of Henry VI and Margaret of Anjou, the last direct Lancastrian heir to the throne, was killed in the fighting or in its immediate aftermath. The precise circumstances of his death remain disputed. Some chronicles claim he was killed in the battle itself, cut down as he tried to flee. Others say he was captured alive and brought before Edward IV, where he was either murdered on the spot or killed by Yorkist lords in a frenzy of vengeance. What is beyond dispute is that the young prince died that day, and with him died the direct Lancastrian line. Edmund Beaufort, along with several other Lancastrian leaders, fled into the sanctuary of Tewkesbury Abbey, hoping that the ancient right of church sanctuary would protect them from Yorkist vengeance. But Edward IV was in no mood for mercy. Despite his own initial promise to pardon those who had sought refuge in the abbey, the king ordered the sanctuary violated. Somerset was dragged from the church and subjected to a brief and perfunctory trial. On the 6th of May, 1471, Edmund Beaufort, styled 4th Duke of Somerset, was beheaded at Tewkesbury. He was about 33 years old. He had never married and left no children. His brother John Beaufort, the Marquis of Dorset, had been killed in the battle itself 2 days earlier. John, too, had never married and left no issue. With the deaths of Edmund and John at Tewkesbury, the legitimate male line of the House of Beaufort was extinguished. The 3 brothers, Henry, Edmund, and John, had all died violently, all in the service of a cause that had consumed their family and their lives. The portcullis banner of the Beauforts, which had flown on battlefields from St Albans to Tewkesbury, was lowered for the last time. The dynasty that had been born in scandal, legitimised by a pope and a parliament, and raised to power by cardinals and queens, had been destroyed on the fields of civil war. In the space of 16 years, from the first Battle of St Albans in 1455 to the Battle of Tewkesbury in 1471, 4 Beaufort men had been killed. Edmund the Second Duke at St Albans, Henry the Third Duke at Hexham, John the Marquis at Tewkesbury, Edmund the Fourth Duke at Tewkesbury, father and 3 nephews, all of them cut down in a war that their own family had helped to start. The portcullis banner that had flown above Beaufort commands on a dozen battlefields the heavy iron gate that symbolised the family's unyielding determination, was lowered for the last time. The name Beaufort, which had once commanded armies and directed the policies of kings, was now associated only with defeat, with exile, and with death. King Henry VI himself was murdered in the Tower of London on the 21st of May, 1471, probably on the orders of Edward IV, though the official account claimed he died of melancholy and displeasure. With his death, and with the deaths of the Beaufort men at Tewkesbury, the Lancastrian cause was, to all appearances, utterly and permanently finished. Or so it seemed, because in a manor house in the south of England, surrounded by enemies and stripped of almost everything, one Beaufort remained. She had no army, she had no title of her own, she had no power beyond the force of her will and the depth of her faith, but she had something that none of the men who had fought and died on those bloody fields had possessed. She had patience, and she had a son. Her name was Margaret. Margaret Beaufort was born on the 31st of May, 1443, at Bletsoe Castle in Bedfordshire. Her father was John Beaufort, the first Duke of Somerset, the man who had spent 17 years in a French prison and returned to England only to die in disgrace. Her mother was Margaret Beauchamp, a wealthy heiress in her own right. Margaret was their only legitimate child, and from the moment of her birth she was both a prize and a burden, a girl whose Beaufort blood made her valuable to anyone who could control her marriage, and whose gender meant that she could never, under the conventions of the age, exercise power in her own name. Her father died when she was barely a year old, leaving her an orphan of the highest rank, the sole heiress of a duke, with a claim to the blood of Edward III through the Beaufort line. In the brutal arithmetic of medieval politics, a wealthy heiress with royal blood was a commodity to be traded, and Margaret's childhood was shaped by the men who sought to profit from her. Her mother did what she could. Margaret Beauchamp raised her daughter at Bletsoe, ensuring that she was educated, fluent in French, and steeped in the religious devotion that would become one of the defining qualities of Margaret's character. The young girl was intelligent, disciplined, and precocious, qualities that would serve her well in the decades of danger and intrigue that lay ahead. Margaret and her mother were close, and unlike many children of the nobility who were sent away to be raised in the households of other great families, Margaret remained with her mother alongside her half-siblings from Margaret Beauchamp's earlier marriage. It was an arrangement that gave the young girl something unusual for a child of her rank: a stable, loving home. King Henry VI took a personal interest in young Margaret's future. He assigned her 2 successive guardians. First, William de la Pole, the Earl of Suffolk, and then the Duke of Suffolk. These guardians had the legal authority to arrange Margaret's marriage, and they intended to use that authority to serve their own political interests. Margaret's first marriage came when she was just 7 years old. In 1450, she was married to John de la Pole, the second Duke of Suffolk, a match arranged by the King's Court as part of the endless game of political alliance building. But the marriage was annulled in 1453, when Margaret was 10. The reasons for the annulment are not entirely clear. It may have been because the match was deemed politically inexpedient, or because the king wished to redirect Margaret's marriage to serve a different purpose. Whatever the cause, Margaret was once again available on the marriage market. The man chosen for her next was Edmund Tudor, the Earl of Richmond. Edmund was the half-brother of King Henry VI. His mother was Katherine of Valois, the widow of Henry V, who had secretly married a Welsh courtier named Owen Tudor after the king's death. Edmund was a man of some standing, but he was not wealthy, and his chief value lay in his connection to the Lancastrian king. His marriage to Margaret Beaufort was designed to strengthen the Lancastrian cause by binding the Beaufort heiress to the Tudor Lancastrian interest. There is a famous story about Margaret's choice of husband. It was said that the young girl, unsure whether to marry Edmund Tudor or another suitor, prayed to St Nicholas for guidance, and that the saint appeared to her in a vision and told her to accept Edmund. Whether the story is true or not, it reveals something important about Margaret's character. From a very early age, she understood that her life was in the hands of forces larger than herself, and she sought divine guidance with a sincerity that was exceptional, even in an age of deep religious feeling. Margaret was 12 years old when she married Edmund Tudor. She was 13 when she became pregnant. Edmund Tudor did not live to see his child born. In November of 1456, amid the growing disorder of the Wars of the Roses, Edmund was captured by Yorkist forces and imprisoned at Carmarthen Castle in Wales. He fell ill, probably of plague, and died on the 1st of November, 1456. Margaret was left a widow at 13, pregnant and effectively alone. On the 28th of January, 1457, at Pembroke Castle in Wales, Margaret Beaufort gave birth to a son. She named him Henry. The birth was traumatic. Margaret was barely more than a child herself, small in stature, young in years, and physically unprepared for the ordeal. The labour was difficult and dangerous, and there is strong evidence to suggest that the experience left Margaret unable to have any more children. Henry would be her only child, and he would become the centre of her world, the single burning purpose around which her entire existence revolved. The boy who was born at Pembroke Castle that January night would one day be known as Henry VII, the first Tudor King of England. But that day was nearly 30 years away, and the road that led to it was long, dark, and filled with peril. Margaret's third marriage, around 1458, was to Sir Henry Stafford, the second son of Humphrey Stafford, the first Duke of Buckingham. Stafford was a decent man, loyal, steady, and apparently genuinely fond of Margaret. The marriage was childless but companionable, and it provided Margaret with a measure of stability during the increasingly violent years of the 1460s. Throughout these years, Margaret watched the destruction of the Beaufort family with a mixture of grief and cold-eyed pragmatism. Her cousins, Henry, Edmund, and John Beaufort, the three sons of the second Duke of Somerset, were killed one by one on the battlefields of the Wars of the Roses. Hexham took Henry in 1464. Tewkesbury took Edmund and John in 1471. By 1471, Margaret was the last significant Beaufort. The male line was gone, the dukedom was gone, the wealth, the titles, the armies, all gone. But Margaret still had her son, and she still had her blood. Sir Henry Stafford died in 1471, probably of wounds sustained at the Battle of Barnet, and Margaret was widowed for the third time. She was 28 years old and she had already buried 3 husbands. Within a year or two, she married for the 4th and final time, to Thomas Stanley, the 1st Earl of Derby. This was the marriage that would change everything. Thomas Stanley was one of the most powerful men in England, a northern magnate whose estates and military resources rivaled those of any nobleman in the realm. He was also one of the most cautious. Stanley had survived the Wars of the Roses by the simple expedient of never fully committing to either side. He waited, he watched, he calculated, and he acted only when the outcome was certain. It was a strategy that infuriated idealists and impressed pragmatists, and it had kept him alive and powerful through 3 decades of civil war. For Margaret, the Stanley marriage was not about love. It was about power, about placing herself and her son under the protection of a man who had the military muscle to make a difference when the moment came. And Margaret was patient. She had learned patience in a hard school, the school of Beaufort survival, where the women had always lasted longer than the men. Throughout the 1470s, Margaret navigated the treacherous waters of Yorkist England with extraordinary skill. She attended court, paid her respects to King Edward IV, and conducted herself with the careful deference of a noblewoman who had accepted her place in the new order. To all outward appearances, she was a loyal subject, but beneath the surface, she never stopped working for her son. Young Henry Tudor had been in exile since 1471, living in Brittany under the protection of Duke Francis II. Brittany was a semi-independent duchy on the northwest coast of France, and its duke was willing to harbour the young Tudor prince as a useful piece in his own diplomatic games with France and England. For Henry, it was a precarious existence. He was a guest, but also a prisoner, a bargaining chip that could be traded at any moment if the political winds shifted. Edward IV made several attempts to have Henry return to England, and on at least one occasion, Henry narrowly escaped being handed over. Margaret maintained contact with her son through secret letters and trusted messengers, keeping the fragile thread of communication alive across the English Channel. She sent him money when she could. She sent him encouragement always. And she waited with the fierce, unshakable faith of a woman who believed, truly, deeply believed, that God had chosen her son for the throne. The opportunity she had been waiting for came in 1483, when the English political landscape was shattered by one of the most dramatic events in the nation's history. In April of 1483, King Edward IV died suddenly at the age of 40. His eldest son, the 12-year-old Edward V, was proclaimed king. But Edward IV's brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, moved swiftly to seize control. He intercepted the young king on his journey to London, arrested several of the boy's guardians, and installed himself as Lord Protector. Within weeks, Richard had the young Edward and his brother placed in the Tower of London. And then, on the 6th of July, 1483, Richard had himself crowned King Richard III, claiming that his brother's children were illegitimate. The princes in the Tower, the young Edward V and his brother Richard, were never seen in public again. What happened to them remains one of history's most notorious mysteries. Most historians believe they were murdered, probably on Richard's orders, though the precise circumstances have never been proven. Their disappearance sent shockwaves through England and created an opportunity that Margaret Beaufort was uniquely positioned to exploit. With the Lancastrian line all but extinct and the legitimate Yorkist heirs either dead or imprisoned, Margaret's son Henry Tudor was suddenly the most plausible alternative to Richard III. Margaret threw herself into a conspiracy to overthrow the usurper. She made contact with Elizabeth Woodville, the widow of Edward IV, and together they hatched a plan. Henry would return to England, seize the throne, and marry Elizabeth's daughter, Elizabeth of York. thereby uniting the Lancastrian and Yorkist lines and ending the dynastic conflict once and for all. The first attempt, the Buckingham Rebellion of October 1483, failed. The Duke of Buckingham, who had initially supported Richard but then turned against him, raised an army in the west of England while Henry prepared to sail from Brittany. But storms scattered Henry's fleet, and Buckingham's rebellion collapsed. Buckingham was captured and executed. Margaret's role in the conspiracy was discovered. Richard III stripped her of her titles and estates and placed her under what amounted to house arrest, confined to her husband Stanley's household, with strict orders that she was not to communicate with anyone. All contact with her son in France was forbidden. Margaret obeyed none of these restrictions. From her confinement, she continued to plot with a determination that bordered on the reckless. She sent messages to her son through intermediaries, coordinated with her allies in England and abroad, and worked through her husband Stanley and his brother Sir William to ensure that when the next opportunity came, the Stanley forces would be on Henry's side. It was an extraordinary feat of political management, conducted in secret, under the constant threat of discovery and death, by a woman whom the king believed he had silenced. She used every resource at her disposal. Her household servants carried messages. Her chaplains served as go-betweens. Her financial resources, though diminished by Richard's confiscations, were channeled towards the cause. And throughout it all, she prayed, with the fervent, consuming devotion of a woman who saw her son's destiny and her own faith as inseparable. The moment came in the summer of 1485. On the 1st of August 1485, Henry Tudor set sail from the port of Harfleur in France with a small army of roughly 2,000 men. He landed at Mill Bay near Milford Haven in Wales on the 7th of August and immediately began marching east through the Welsh countryside, gathering supporters as he went. Henry's claim to the throne rested on 3 pillars. The first was his Beaufort blood. He was the great-great-grandson of John of Gaunt and Katherine Swynford, descended through his mother Margaret from the Beaufort line of the House of Lancaster. The second was his right of conquest, the simple, brutal principle that the man who defeated the king in battle had the right to rule. And the third was a promise. Henry had pledged to marry Elizabeth of York, the eldest daughter of Edward IV, thereby uniting the warring houses of Lancaster and York and bringing the Wars of the Roses to an end. As Henry marched through Wales and into the English Midlands, the question that hung over the campaign was the one that had hung over the Stanley family for decades. Which side would Thomas Stanley choose? Margaret Beaufort had done everything in her power to ensure that her husband would support her son. But Stanley was, as always, cautious. He positioned his forces near the battlefield but refused to commit them until he could see which way the battle was going. His brother, Sir William Stanley, did the same. On the 22nd of August 1485, the two armies met near the town of Market Bosworth in Leicestershire. Richard III commanded a larger force, perhaps 12,000 men to Henry's 5,000. But Richard's army was not entirely loyal. The Duke of Northumberland, who commanded a substantial contingent, held his men back and refused to engage. And the Stanleys, with their 3,000 or more troops, hovered on the flanks, watching and waiting, just as Margaret had known they would, just as they had always done, biding their time until the outcome was certain enough to justify commitment. The morning of the battle dawned grey and uncertain. The two armies were arrayed on the gently rising ground near Ambion Hill, with Richard holding the higher ground and Henry's smaller force positioned below. Between them, and to the side, the Stanleys waited in a maddening neutrality that must have tormented Margaret, far away in her manor, unable to do anything but pray. The battle began with an exchange of artillery fire, followed by a clash of infantry. The Yorkist vanguard, commanded by the Duke of Norfolk, pushed forward against Henry's line, and for a time the fighting was fierce and close. Norfolk was killed in the melee, one of the first major casualties of the day, but the battle's outcome remained uncertain. The Stanleys had not moved. Northumberland had not moved. The issue hung in the balance, and every moment that passed without a decisive blow was a moment of agony for both sides. Richard, whatever his faults as a king, was no coward. He had the warrior blood of his father, the Duke of York, and the reckless courage that had made the Plantagenet kings both celebrated and feared. When he saw Henry Tudor's banner across the field, the red dragon of Cadwallader, the banner of Wales, he made a fateful decision. He would not wait for the Stanleys. He would not rely on Northumberland. He would end the war himself with a single charge, man to man, king against pretender. Gathering his household knights around him, the hardened veterans of his personal retinue, armed and armoured and utterly loyal, Richard launched a direct assault on Henry's position. The charge was thunderous. Richard's cavalry smashed through the Tudor bodyguard, cutting down Henry's standard-bearer, Sir William Brandon, and unhorsing the giant Sir John Cheney, one of the strongest men in England. For a moment, Richard was within striking distance of Henry himself. For a moment, it seemed as though the gamble would succeed, that the war would end with a single sword stroke, and the Beaufort blood would sink back into the mud of a Leicestershire field. But at the critical moment, Sir William Stanley committed his forces. The Stanley cavalry struck Richard's exposed flank with devastating effect, and the royal charge collapsed into chaos. Richard was unhorsed, surrounded, and cut down. He died fighting, the crown of England tumbling from his helmet into the dirt and the grass. He was the last English king to die in battle, and his death marked the end of the Plantagenet dynasty that had ruled England for more than 300 years. According to tradition, the crown of England was found lying in a hawthorn bush on the battlefield. Lord Stanley, Margaret Beaufort's husband, retrieved it and placed it on his stepson's head. Henry Tudor was proclaimed King Henry VII on the field of Bosworth. The Beaufort blood had reached the throne at last. Think about the journey. 4 illegitimate children, born to a prince and his mistress in the 1370s. Legitimised by a pope and a parliament. Barred from the throne by 3 Latin words scribbled into a document. Their sons had been cardinals and dukes, their daughters queens and countesses. They had fought on every battlefield of the Wars of the Roses, and the male line had been destroyed. Every last one of them killed or executed. The family had been reduced to a single woman, a widow 4 times over, who had been stripped of her titles and placed under house arrest by a king who believed he had crushed her. And that woman, Margaret Beaufort, had put her son on the throne of England. Henry VII entered London in triumph. He was crowned at Westminster Abbey on the 30th of October, 1485, and in January of 1486 he married Elizabeth of York, fulfilling his promise to unite the 2 warring houses. The Red Rose of Lancaster and the White Rose of York were joined in the Tudor Rose, and the Wars of the Roses were over. The dynasty that had begun with 4 bastard children, born in secret to a prince and his mistress, had produced the king who would end the bloodiest civil war in English history. For Margaret Beaufort, it was the culmination of a lifetime of struggle. The girl who had been married off at 7, widowed at 13, and stripped of her titles by a usurper king, had achieved something that no Beaufort before her had managed. She had placed her blood on the throne of England. The clause that was supposed to bar the Beauforts from the crown, excepta dignitat regali, had been swept aside, not by legal argument, but by the force of arms and the will of a woman who refused to accept the limits the world had placed upon her. Her son was king, and she was the most powerful woman in England. Second only to the Queen, and, in many respects, surpassing even her. Henry gave his mother a specially created title, My Lady the King's Mother, since Margaret had never been a queen and could not be called Queen Mother. She signed her letters as Margaret R., using the regal initial as if she were a queen in all but name. She wore clothes of the same quality as her daughter-in-law, Elizabeth of York, and walked only half a pace behind the Queen at court, a breach of protocol that would have been unthinkable from anyone else, but which Henry tolerated because his mother was, quite simply, untouchable. The relationship between Margaret and her daughter-in-law was complex. Elizabeth of York was a Yorkist princess, the daughter of Edward IV, the granddaughter of Cecily Neville, and therefore herself a descendant of Joan Beaufort through the Neville line. The two women were connected by blood through the same tangled web that had produced the Wars of the Roses. They cooperated on many matters, particularly the arrangement of royal marriages for the next generation. But there was an undeniable tension between them, a quiet competition for influence and precedence that ran beneath the surface of their public partnership. Margaret threw herself into the role of King's mother with characteristic energy. She shaped the look and feel of the Tudor court, establishing protocols for royal births and ceremonies that would be followed for generations. She organized the education and upbringing of her grandchildren, including the future Henry VIII. She managed estates, directed patronage, and ensured that her loyal supporters were rewarded with positions in government and the church. She arranged the marriage of her grandson Arthur, the Prince of Wales, to Katherine of Aragon, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, a match that was intended to cement England's place among the great powers of Europe, though it would eventually lead to one of the most consequential events in English history, when Henry VIII sought to annul his own marriage to Katherine decades later, setting in motion the English Reformation. Margaret could not have foreseen that outcome, but the marriage itself was a testament to how far the Beauforts had come. A family that had once been barred from the throne was now arranging marriages with the most powerful royal house on the continent. But Margaret's greatest legacy may have been in education. Driven by the deep religious devotion that had sustained her through decades of hardship, she became one of the most important patrons of learning in English history. She founded 2 colleges at the University of Cambridge, Christ's College and St John's College, endowing them with the wealth that the Beaufort name had finally brought within her grasp. She patronized the English printers, William Caxton and Wynkyn de Worde, and she translated several devotional books herself, contributing to the growing body of English-language religious literature. She also donated funds to a grammar school in Wimborne Minster. The church, where her father, the first Duke of Somerset, had been buried more than 60 years earlier. Even in her acts of charity, Margaret remembered her Beaufort roots. In 1499, at the age of 56, Margaret took a vow of chastity and moved to her own household at Collyweston in Northamptonshire, where she lived in a style that was, in all but name, royal. She was surrounded by servants, chaplains, and scholars. She continued to exercise influence over the court and her relationship with her son, the boy she had borne at 13, the exile she had plotted and schemed and prayed to put on the throne, remained the central bond of her life. Henry VII died on the 21st of April 1509 at Richmond Palace. He was 52 years old and he had ruled England for nearly a quarter of a century. A remarkable achievement for a man who had seized the throne with a borrowed army and a disputed bloodline. His reign had been stable, prosperous, and, above all, secure. He had defeated every rebellion, neutralized every pretender, and built a treasury that was the envy of Europe. The Tudor dynasty that Margaret Beaufort had fought so hard to establish was firmly in place. Margaret survived her son by just 2 months. She was present for the final days of Henry's reign, attending to the arrangements for the succession with the same meticulous care that had characterized her entire life. She oversaw the transition of power to her grandson, Henry VIII, and she was present at the coronation celebrations for the new king, who turned 18 on the 28th of June, 1509. Margaret had lived long enough to see her life's work completed. Her son had reigned for 24 years. Her grandson was now king. The Tudor dynasty was secure. The Beaufort blood that had begun in scandal and been barred from the throne by 3 Latin words was now the foundation of the most powerful royal house in English history. She had done what she set out to do, not in a single bold stroke, but through decades of patient, unrelenting effort, through 4 marriages and 3 widowhoods, through exile and house arrest and constant danger. She had outlasted every enemy, outmaneuvered every rival, and outlived every man who had tried to stop her. The following day, the 29th of June, 1509, Margaret Beaufort died. She was 66 years old. She was buried in the Henry VII Lady Chapel at Westminster Abbey, the magnificent chapel that her son had built as a monument to the Tudor dynasty. Her tomb, designed by the Italian sculptor Pietro Torrigiano, lies close to that of her son and daughter-in-law. In death, as in life, Margaret Beaufort was never far from the centre of Tudor power. With Margaret's death, the direct Beaufort line that had begun with John of Gaunt and Katherine Swynford more than a century earlier came to its close. The brothers were gone. All 4 of John of Gaunt's Beaufort children had died long ago, and the male Somerset line had been extinguished at Tewkesbury in 1471. Margaret had been the last bridge between the Beauforts and the throne, and now she too was gone. But the Beaufort name did not die with her. Remember Charles Somerset, the illegitimate son of Henry Beaufort, the 3rd Duke of Somerset, born around 1460 to the Duke's mistress Joan Hill. Charles had been raised in exile in Flanders during the worst years of the wars. A bastard's bastard, the illegitimate child of a family that had itself been born illegitimate. He had no title, no estate, no right to the name his father had carried. But when Henry VII won the throne, Charles Somerset came to England and was welcomed. Henry VII was not the sort of man to forget that the Beauforts were his people, his mother's family, the blood that had given him his claim. Charles was given the surname Somerset, appointed to positions of trust, and in 1506 was created Baron Herbert. In 1513, his status was elevated further. He was created Earl of Worcester, a title of considerable dignity. From Charles Somerset, Earl of Worcester, descended a line that would carry the Beaufort heritage forward through the centuries. His son Henry became the 2nd Earl. His grandson William became the 3rd. The line continued through civil war and restoration, through marquesates and political upheaval, until in 1682, King Charles II created Henry Somerset, the 3rd Marquess of Worcester, a direct descendant of Charles Somerset and, through him, of the 3rd Duke of Somerset and John of Gaunt and Katherine Swynford, the 1st Duke of Beaufort. The Dukedom of Beaufort is the only current English dukedom named after a place outside the British Isles. Montmorency Beaufort in Champagne, the old French lordship that John of Gaunt had given as a surname to his illegitimate children 600 years ago. The Dukes of Beaufort have held the title for over 300 years. Their seat is Badminton House in Gloucestershire, one of the great country houses of England. The 12th Duke of Beaufort holds the title today, and the family still uses Somerset as their surname. Think of the journey. A castle in Champagne gives its name to 4 illegitimate children. Those children are legitimized, barred from the throne, and raised to power. Their sons become cardinals and dukes. Their daughters become queens. A civil war destroys the male line. A single woman schemes for 30 years and places her son on the throne. An illegitimate grandson, born to a mistress, carries the bloodline forward through the centuries. And today, at Badminton House, the name Beaufort still endures. The family's emblem, the portcullis, endures as well. The Tudors adopted it from the Beauforts, and it became one of the most recognisable symbols of Tudor power. After the Tudors, it was adopted by Parliament. Today, the portcullis appears on the gates of the Palace of Westminster, on the sovereign's coins, and on official parliamentary documents. Every time you see it, you are looking at a reminder of a family that was born in scandal, raised in shadow, and told that it could never rule. They ruled anyway. There is something in the story of the Beauforts that speaks to a truth beyond medieval politics and dynastic ambition. It is the truth that legitimacy is not given, it is made. The Beauforts were told they were bastards and they became earls. They were told they could not inherit and they became dukes. They were told they could never sit upon the throne, and they built the Tudor Dynasty, the most famous royal house in English history. They did it not through a single great act of heroism or a single decisive battle, but through something quieter and more enduring, through patience, through cunning, through marriages carefully made and alliances carefully tended, through the stubborn refusal of generation after generation to accept the limits that the world had placed upon them. And at the heart of it all was love. The story of the Beauforts began with a love that defied convention. A prince and a widow, a duke and a governess, a man and a woman who chose each other against the expectations of their world. John of Gaunt and Katherine Swynford could not have known, when they began their forbidden affair in the chambers of the Lancastrian household, that their love would reshape the history of England. They could not have known that their children, born in secret and raised in shadow, would one day sit at the centre of English power. They could not have known that the name they gave those children, a name borrowed from a distant French castle, would echo through 600 years of history and still be spoken today. But it does. The name endures. The blood endures. And the story of love and scandal, of ambition and destruction, of a family that the world tried again and again to push to the margins, but that refused, always and forever, to stay there. The story endures as well. And now the fire burns low. The candles have guttered to nothing. The great house is quiet, and the stories of the Beauforts, their triumphs, their tragedies, and their long, improbable survival, settle into the stillness like dust in an ancient hall. Let them carry you now, gently and softly, into sleep. Good night.